Welcome to Let's Talk About It Sunday, an extension of KELA's weekday local talk show featuring a variety of subjects of local interest. This program was pre-recorded, so we're unable to take live calls on today's show. And now, let's talk about it.
Welcome to Let's Talk About It on AM 1470 KELA and KMNT, or maybe you're streaming at KELAAM.com or maybe KMNT.com. I'm your host, Peter Abbarno, on another edition of the Let's Talk About It show, and we are entering one of those seasons. And while it's Christmas and it's New Year's, it's also the season where there's a lot of DUIs. There's a lot of people on the roads who have been drinking or cannabis use. It's dark, it's wet, and so you see a lot more collisions and DUIs and fatalities. And we know from the Washington Traffic Safety Commission that fatalities in the state of Washington are on the rise, and many can be attributed to the use of different substances. They're at night when it's dark and rainy. And of course, you can't ignore the fact that people are celebrating during Thanksgiving when they have time off, maybe during Christmas. So I'm here with Jake McGhie. Jake is an attorney with Althauser Rayan Abbarno. We're going to talk a little bit about, one, we all know you shouldn't be drinking and driving, but, what should you do? How can you avoid it? Things that you can maybe try to do to protect yourself. Jake McGhie, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's been, probably a couple of years since I've been in this studio, and it's great to be back.
Well, what's good, Jake, is that it should feel like old territory since you hosted a couple of these shows for a while.
Yeah, I think it was back in 2019, but I was the Monday morning host for a little while. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is. It is fun. And then since that time, you're married, you have a kid, your whole life has changed.
Became a partner at some law firm in town.
Yeah, well, I don't know, maybe Althauser Rayan Abbarno. But so let's talk. I mean, we're in the holiday season. One of the areas that you practice is criminal defense. You also do personal injury, which in this time of year, especially when we're talking about November, December, January, can often and sadly kind of be connected because a lot of people will drink and drive. A lot of people will drink, drive, and cause accidents. So let's talk a little bit about what not to do.
You're right. I represent people who have been charged with DUIs. I represent people charged with all kinds of crimes. But the most important thing I can probably tell people when it comes to DUIs or how to prepare for their case is don't need me at all. Right. So as we approach the holiday season, it's always important to know you're going to be around family. You might be traveling somewhere. There's going to be booze there, right? It's Thanksgiving. It's Christmas. I know I partake in bourbon every once in a while on Thanksgiving and maybe, for the whole weekend after that. But planning is always the biggest thing. And I think that's where a lot of people really, get in trouble is they don't do that forward thinking thought like, okay, I'm going to grandma's house. What's going to happen? How am I going to get home? So I always try to tell people it's important to plan who's going to drive there, who's going to drive home. What's our plan for after the celebration? Are we going to Uber? Are we going to Lyft? I know in our area, the options are limited, but they're out there. And it's important to, try to figure out, is that going to be an option for me? Because if you rely on Uber and, you get to 11:30 on Saturday night and you open up the app and there's no drivers, you got to have a plan B, right? So the most important thing and what I beg people to do is please don't need me. Don't put yourself in that situation where you're calling me at 3 a.m. because you're sitting in front of a Draeger breath machine, right?
Right.
I welcome those calls, but I really hope that I never have to answer them.
If somebody is pulled over, and they give you a call, what's your kind of initial advice?
Well, and there's always different stages because the first part of any sort of situation like this is that first contact with law enforcement. That could be being pulled over. It could be for individuals who might have, driven off the road or had a crash of some kind and law enforcement comes afterwards. I always tell people there's a time and a place to fight things. It's never on the side of the road with the cop, right? Yeah. So everyone always gets brownie points for being compliant. The most important thing is if you are arrested, always important to, at that point, invoke your right to silence. Once you're placed under arrest, you don't have any requirement to answer questions, and it's generally good advice to not. In the state of Washington, we have what's called the implied consent law, which if you're behind the wheel of a car, if you're driving, you've, at that point, implied your consent to submit to a breath test if law enforcement requests one from you. Now, under statute, you also do have a right to refuse that breath test if it's requested, but there's consequences that come along with it. Courts have ruled on this. It's a constitutional structure. Those penalties can flow. So if a breath test is requested, you do have the right to call and speak to an attorney before that happens. It's a good idea to do that. What's probably going to be advised is do the breath test because the law requires it. And then after that point, if the evidence that's obtained in that breath test leads to you being charged with a DUI or any other crime, you need to lawyer up. Yeah. You need to call an attorney, you need to get one on your side and start to prepare your defense in court. That's where you raise your rights and it's where you fight.
When you talk about raising your defense and talking about your rights, a lot of folks get confused a little bit because they think, well, if I lawyer up, it's an automatic. I'm fighting that I did it. Is it that you're saying that you're not doing it, or you're trying to negotiate a way to maybe go through treatment or to lower the charge, or in some cases get out just altogether? I mean,
it can be all of that.
Okay.
Right. So attorneys, primarily, what an attorney is there to do is to fight for your best interest, whatever those interests might be. That might be fighting the case and trying to get it thrown out, because let's be frank here, the government screws up sometimes. Sometimes the evidence isn't there. Sometimes the government accuses people of crimes that they didn't commit. However, let's be frank about this. Like I said, the vast majority of times when people are charged, arrested for a DUI, it's because they drank too much and were driving.
Right, they did
it.
Right.
Right. So in those cases, the thing about DUIs is it's a gross misdemeanor, which means it's not the most serious crime you can commit. But as far as gross misdemeanors go, it's about the worst one you can. There's the most consequences. It's one of the only gross misdemeanors that carry mandatory minimum sentences, which means if you're convicted, there's things the court has to do to you. So there's a lot of ways that DUIs can impact your life, maybe more so than, other more piddly, petty crimes. Our job as an attorney is to try to fight for your best interest and try to mitigate those things so that even if you end up with something on your record, it's not something that can affect you or follow you around as severely as a DUI generally will.
If you're just tuning in to Let's Talk About It on AM 1470 KELA or KMNT 104.3, I'm your host, Peter Abbarno, with my special guest today, Jakob McGhie with the law firm Althauser Rayan Abbarno. And Jakob, when we talk about DUIs following people, the one thing that they'll ask is, can I eventually get this expunged from my record? Can I, if I get charged or convicted of a DUI, can I just walk away from it eventually if I do everything I'm supposed to?
Well, it's a great question because vacating records, getting your rights back, it's a big part of my practice. It's something I care pretty deeply about. DUIs, unfortunately, cannot get removed from your record, which is why it's really important if you've been accused of that, to have an attorney fighting for your interests, because if you can resolve that charge without being convicted of a DUI, that opens up those possibilities of potentially getting your record cleared down the road. If, like you said, you pay your fines, you serve your time, you do all of the affirmative things that the court orders you to do, you have an opportunity down the road to eventually have that go away. But DUIs themselves, if you're convicted of a DUI, cannot be removed from your record.
So what are some of those things that someone would be required to do or might do if they are arrested for DUI, they appear in court, they have Jakob McGhie next to them? What are some of the things that often potentially your clients might do to get that reduced, or maybe to mitigate some of those damages there?
Anytime anyone's charged with a crime, the court always approaches things with certain policies in mind, and those are retribution, so punishing people for wrong acts they commit, but also rehabilitation. So especially in context of DUI charges, courts will order people to, one, engage in treatment if they need it, and also to attend educational things like a victim impact panel, where people hear about the experiences of the victims of drunk driving, people who have been in car crashes, people who have lost loved ones in car crashes involving an impaired driver. The court will order you to do these things just because they're good, right? It helps protect the public if you have a problem with alcohol and getting it treated. And also, there are things that people, even though we think we might know stuff, once you actually hear someone's story, once you actually see the experience of someone else having been involved with someone who was drinking and driving and caused an accident, it hits you in a different way. Right. And courts know that, and so they order people to try to get that information. These are things that are advisable to do. The sooner that you take these steps, it really does help in the negotiating process and in representing these folks to the court.
So one of the things that you would recommend is, even if the court hasn't ordered it, you haven't showed up, a good thing to do would be, give you a call. You can help them kind of find a way to get into a victim impact meeting or start to mitigate those Because in reality, that's probably for the folks who made a mistake. They went to a family thing, or this is their first time, they had a little bit too much, who are probably amenable to not ever doing this again, right?
Right. Well, step one is always talking to an attorney first.
Right.
You know, that should be the first thing you do once you get to the jail or get out of jail.
Well, then you offer free, and most criminal attorneys do offer free consults.
That's right.
Yeah.
And really having that advice, because every situation is different. So call your attorney first. But then also, trying to take those affirmative steps really does show that you're a person that the court can maybe give a little bit of lenience, because that's an important part of advocacy, is showing the court there are people who need to be punished, frankly.
Yeah.
And you don't want to look like one of them. So that's a good way to do it.
Yeah, and you don't want to be that person either. I mean, that's part of it too. The other thing is, in addition to, it being on your record, that's something that you can't vacate, the cost. Talk a little bit about some ignition locks and things like that. I mean, that could be pricey.
The whole thing can be incredibly pricey. A DUI really can be a life-changing event if you're in a particular circumstance, for anyone in any circumstance. But the one that you highlighted was the requirement for an ignition interlock device. So anyone who's convicted of a DUI, that's a mandatory punishment or condition. It's not really a punishment. It's really a requirement for anyone who's had that happen. For at least a year, you have to keep an ignition interlock device in your car. That's the thing that keeps your car from starting until you blow into it to prove to the car that you're not too drunk to drive.
Right.
Now, those don't come free, right? That's something that you rent from a private company. It has to be maintained on sometimes a monthly, but mostly a quarterly basis. Providers don't do those calibrations for free, right?
Right.
So you're paying monthly, you're paying for calibrations. That's a big part of it. The other big consequences of a DUI, even an arrest, is what happens to your license. If you're arrested for a DUI, whether you refuse that breath test or you do it, if your breath is over a 0.08, you're losing your license for some period of time. There are costs to get it back. Like I was talking about earlier, there's mandatory minimum penalties for DUI charges. That includes minimum fines, meaning even if the court wants to do so, they can't make you pay any less than $990.50 in costs and assessments if you're convicted of a DUI. It just highlights why it's important to be represented, to have your interests represented, to try to mitigate some of these what can be outrageous costs if they're not mitigated.
You are listening to Let's Talk About It Sunday, an extension of KELA's weekday local talk show. Stay tuned. Let's Talk About It Sunday edition will return in a moment.
Okay, and now back to business.
Listen on the air and online.
Let's talk about it. Good morning. You're listening to Let's Talk About It Sunday, an extension of KELA's weekday local talk show. This program was pre-recorded, so no live phone calls on today's show.
And if you're just tuning in to Let's Talk About It on AM 1470, KELA or KMNT 104.3, my guest today is Jakob McGhie with the law firm of Althauser Rayan Abbarno, and we're talking about DUIs, and we're going to talk a little bit about the problem that Washington State is facing, which is you're seeing a lot more fatalities, a lot more DUIs, a lot more cannabis arrests. For some folks who are listening to the show, they may be saying, well, why are we talking about how to get out of these? Why are we talking about defending people who are getting DUIs? Well, one, it's their right to have a defense, right? We know that. But also, it should scare you a little bit that you shouldn't be doing this. I mean, one of the things that sticks out to me about the beginning of this interview is you're like, the first thing I want to tell you is I don't ever want to get your call, right? I mean, You don't want people to need you. You live in this community like we do. The last thing you want is to hear that your neighbor, a community member, is drinking and driving. So the goal is to get them to not do that first.
Absolutely. And, I get the question all the time because I'm a criminal defense attorney. So people ask me, how can you do that? How can you represent those people? And the way I look at it is, I'm not necessarily defending the actions of people who commit crimes, but what I am trying to do is to make sure that if the government can do stuff to them, that they're following all the procedures, that constitutional rights are being observed and fought for. And if punishment is assessed, it's done so after good due process, right? As a lawyer, that's how I look at it. Is I'm not necessarily saying that guy is the best guy and we should, wash his card and give him $1,000, but I do want to make sure that the government is doing their job and not hurting people, because maybe that guy did something, but the innocent person that gets accused, I want to make sure that those procedures are in place for that guy too.
And the other thing is, it's not a simple process for people. You talked a little bit about the court process, and then you alluded to, you've got the whole licensing issue of the administrative side. I mean, it can be a pretty complicated situation.
It really can. And that's why, for anyone who's been accused of a DUI, it's kind of important to make sure that the attorney that you do get on your side to help you with these things kind of knows what they're doing, because DUI can be a pretty specialized area of law. There's so many things that come along with it, including the administrative side of license suspensions, which, a lot of people don't realize. If you get arrested for a DUI, you've got 7 days from the date of your arrest to request a hearing with the DOL to challenge that suspension. Say you have a CDL. So it is part of your livelihood to drive. If you get a DUI, your CDL goes away. It's gone for a year. All right. So if you need to have due process associated with that, to be able to argue to a hearing officer that there wasn't evidence that I was drinking and driving, that there's some procedural mishap in this, that it makes it unfair for this to happen to me, you've got to assert that right within 7 days or it's gone forever. So that's why it's important, you get on the phone, you talk to an attorney, and you do it right away. Make sure that you're not missing any of these important rights, and making sure that the person that you're talking to knows what they're doing and knows how to address your charge.
If you're just tuning in to Let's Talk About It on AM 1470 KELA or KMNT 104.3, I'm your host, Peter Abbarno, on the Let's Talk About It show with my guest today, attorney with Althauser Rayan Abbarno, Jakob McGhie. We talk a lot about the DUI side of it, kind of what you need to do, and making sure you assert your rights to go through that due process. And guilty, innocent, or anywhere in between, one of the important things is making sure you at least understand your rights, understand the process, which can be really confusing. Now, on the other side of it, there's a lot of folks who get hit, get injured,
right.
Whether it be personal or property. That's also something that the law firm represents individuals to, not the same person who hurt you, but personal injury cases and car accidents are happening all the time. And we know from the state of Washington crash statistics that the portal you can see from the Washington Department of Transportation, car accidents are up, and sadly, fatalities are up. And a lot of that it's kind of unexplained, but people also need attorneys if they get hurt.
That's right, absolutely. And it's really important to make sure that you understand, just like we were talking about before, if you've been the victim of something like this, if you were the person who's not at fault, someone ran into you, you've been injured, you need to know your rights just as much as the other guy does. If certain things aren't secured at the right time, you might lose the ability to, really go after being made whole, which is really important. That's an important aspect of civil law, is when someone has suffered some sort of loss or injury because of the wrongful actions of someone else, the law helps that person be made whole, get back what they lost because of the actions of the other person. So yeah, it's vital that you make sure you know what you're doing and follow up on things if you're in some sort of accident.
And that's always an interesting kind of dichotomy of the law, because when you're talking about a DUI, you're talking about the criminal side, that's criminal law. And if you're talking about Department of Licensing, that's administrative law.
Right.
But then when you're talking about you're a pedestrian, you're riding a bicycle, or you're in another car and you get hit by somebody and you get hurt, that's a civil action. And so you can potentially, in a car accident involving someone who is committing a DUI, you could have all facets of the law implicated in one collision.
Right. No, like you said, obviously not one attorney handling all aspects of it, and sometimes unfortunately, but it really is interesting how one insular event can really implicate so many different things in the law.
In addition to seeing car accidents on the rise, especially this time of year where it's dark early, right about now is when I'm starting to get to work and it's dark, and you're starting to get home about when it's the sun's starting to set. And at some point in about sometime in December, January, it's going to be feel like it's dark 24 hours. You're seeing a lot of car accidents go up, and you're seeing a lot of people get injured. A statistic that was really surprising to me was that almost 1 out of 5 individuals driving on the road today in the state of Washington is not insured. So if they hit you and they're not insured, you're really limited in how to become quote unquote made whole or get your fair compensation.
That's really true. I mean, it's one of the scourges on the road is uninsured drivers, because that insurance, the thing that all of us lawful drivers have, the minimum insurance, that's a social pact we all make with one another, that if something happens, even if it is an accident, right? Things get paid for, people can be made whole. But we know that there are people who don't have licenses, who don't have insurance, and they're out on the road. And that's a really big deal, because if you are injured, there's no pot of money to necessarily go after. And if someone doesn't have insurance, it's not likely that they have assets that you can pursue either, right? Because civil law does give you the ability to, one, have a judge say, yes, you're entitled to compensation. But it also, there's mechanisms in the law to make sure that you actually get paid on that judgment.
Right.
But if someone doesn't have anything, if they don't have insurance, if they're not a person of any particular means, then the victims of their wrongdoing just go unpaid, go uncompensated. They're not made whole. So that's where, when we talk with our clients who, before they come and consult with us, before something has happened, and they want to know how can they protect themselves, we always harp on UIM insurance, underinsured motorist insurance, because it's something that, it's a cost to you, but it is a huge lifesaver if you ever end up needing it.
And I think that's would probably go just like you were talked earlier on the criminal side. If you're in a car accident, one of the first things you're probably going to want to do is start assessing, all right, am I hurt? Got to go to the doctor. Should I call an attorney to navigate this whole insurance aspect to it? Because it can get complicated too, whether it's just straight civil or there's some criminal aspects to it. And quite honestly, if you get hit by someone committing a DUI or a hit and run, you might actually be able to go through L&I. And it's the L&I, not workers' comp, but the L&I for Crime Victims Fund, which can help pay for things. So that adds another layer of complication to it.
Right. One, and anytime anyone's in an accident like that, kind of like we were talking about, what do I do? The first thing to remember is everyone has a duty. If you're in a car, you're driving, and there's an accident of some kind. If someone's injured, or if there's substantial amount of property damage, everyone has the duty to report that to law enforcement. And that's always an important first step, because that's going to be the entity that's really going to do that initial fact finding and really kind of figure out the story of what happened with this accident. The second thing is to really assess yourself, because when you're in some sort of event, some sort of traumatic event, your body acts in different ways. And you may not think in that moment, oh, I'm hurt. And then as the minutes and the hours go by, you start to realize maybe something's wrong here. Self-assess, and if you need medical treatment, it's imperative that you get it.
I think that, especially if you get hurt in a car accident, you don't always know right away. I mean, a lot of people get hurt right away, and you just know. Others, it's kind of like sometimes going to the gym, the lactic acid, the other things build up, and then the next day you're like, I can't turn my neck, or man, my back hurts, and you go in and you find out you're more hurt than you really were, because adrenaline kicks in the day of the accident. You're thinking of other things. You're worried. You may not even know for another day or two that how hurt you might really be.
I don't know. You've probably heard it. I have in my practice. Was this person actually hurt? They didn't even go to the doctor for 4 days, right?
Right.
Trying to downplay injuries that we've all had that experience. Like, things manifest themselves later, but it's and we're not saying to just run to the doctor anytime either, but to be really just look at yourself, and if something major like a car accident has happened, don't hesitate. Don't say, oh, I don't know if I need to. Get checked out, because you never know, and you want to make sure that you're getting treatment right away. Most importantly, because it's important to get better. That's always the primary focus here, is making sure that you can get better and get back to where you were before the accident happened.
So what do you say to folks who, and I've heard this before throughout my career, well, look, I'm not here to make rich. I don't really want to sue somebody. I don't really want a lot of money on it. But our only system of law is to try to fully compensate someone. You can't turn back time. I mean, what do you say to folks who are like, well, I don't want to go after anyone. I don't think this is worth a lot of money, or I'm not sue happy.
It's about fairness.
Right.
It's about, you're the one who suffered a loss. Our system of law, our system of justice demands, before anything else, fairness. And the only way that the court or the law can really measure that is monetarily.
Not
right?
a time machine.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You can't sue the court to get you a new back, or sue the defendant to have them give you a new back. I would love for that to be a thing, right? But in order for you to be made whole, that means being able to get the treatment that you need and not have the cost of that come out of your pocket. It means being able to have some compensation for the things that you lost that otherwise can't be quantified. A lot of times we're dealing with people who have had injuries, and obviously there's doctor bills that come with that, but the trauma, the suffering, the pain that comes along with having to deal with these injuries that you didn't have before and were caused by someone else in their negligence. There's value, there's fairness in being compensated for that.
Well, and also there's some contractual requirements too, because if, for instance, if you get hurt in a car accident and you use, say, your private medical insurance, and your private medical insurance finds out that it was a car accident, I think under some of those policies, you have an obligation to seek reimbursement from the actual tortfeasor or the person who hurt you.
Right. They don't want to have to pay for your stuff if they shouldn't have to either.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest involved in any one of these cases.
There is. If you're just tuning in to Let's Talk About It on AM 1470 KELA or 104.3 KMNT, I'm with Jakob McGhie with the law firm of Althauser Rayan Abbarno. So what are some of the things that you would advise people? I mean, I assume one of the first things you would advise people to do is make sure you don't waive your PIP and UIM coverage in your insurance plan.
Absolutely. And, it's pennies and dollars every month that maybe it's hard to figure out how to afford that. But really, if you end up needing it, the value in it is so much greater than the upfront cost. But it can be so protective in times of crisis or trauma. So definitely, make sure that you have those coverages. Never be in a car, man. I mean, so with fatalities rising the way they are. But the important thing to realize too is, there's people on the road. Things like UIM coverage, that can cover you if you're a pedestrian as well. Now, you want to check with your insurance provider about that and see if that's a coverage that's provided. But, these things can cover you and your family, even in situations where you may not realize it.
And you're seeing a rise in pedestrian collisions and bicyclists. And the city of Centralia just did their patrol in downtown Centralia where they were catching people who weren't stopping for pedestrians, who are speeding down Tower and Pearl. Whether you're on a big, thoroughfare or you're on a small side street, I mean, you may be able to control you, but you can't control what other people are doing. So it's important that you have coverage and protect yourself.
Right. I remember it was just this last year. I saw a certain Peter Abbarno almost get waylaid crossing the crosswalk on Tower Avenue.
That may have been purposeful, though. I mean, that was an attempted murder. But no, you're right. I mean, I'm always kind of very careful, and especially with my kids. They're young. They're 10 and 12, and so when they're riding around or on their skateboards, I'm always like, you just, even if you're being safe, you have to know what's going on in your environment.
Absolutely, absolutely, and do what you can to protect you and your family for things that you're never going to prevent everything bad from happening, but there are ways to mitigate that. As we were talking about before, as attorneys, that's what we try to do best, is address and help people in times of crisis to mitigate bad things and to maximize the good.
Jakob, if somebody wants to call you for a free consult on maybe criminal defense issue, the personal injury issues, and they have some questions, I mean, both of those are free. How do they contact you?
Well, they can call my office. The number is 360-736-1301. They can also contact us by going to our website at www.centralialaw.com. There's a page where you can enter a question or an email, get sent right to us, and we get back to you hopefully within a business day.
I think for me, that's probably one of the best services that you can get, being able to ask these questions for free, because a lot of times it's confusing to navigate, and you're here to help, and I appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.
All right, you're listening to Let's Talk About AM 1470 KELA and KMNT. Appreciate you tuning into the Let's Talk About It show. If you have a question or comment, or you want to reach out to Jakob McGhie, 360-736-1301 or centralialaw.com. Thank you. Have a great day.